Today's leaders are faced with a host of challenges, whether it's managing a remote team, keeping pace with industry advancements, or navigating difficult conversations with employees. That's why Training Industry's leading leadership development certificate program was designed to give you the skills you need to manage successful leadership training programs, which, in today's business climate, is imperative for lasting success. Explore what makes a great leadership development program and learn strategies to develop your current and future leaders. For more information on the program, visit trainingindustry.com/LLD. Welcome to the Business of Learning, the Learning Leaders podcast from Training Industry, where we speak with industry experts and thought leaders on all things learning and development. Hi, welcome back to the Business of Learning. I'm Sarah Gallo, a senior editor here at Training Industry.
And I'm Michelle Edelston-Schwartz, editor-in-chief. Today we're talking about a topic that in the age of artificial intelligence is perhaps more relevant than ever: developing emotional intelligence in leaders. With us, we have Dr. Mikah Sellers, best-selling author, workforce futurist, and enterprise transformation leader. Mikah, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. And certainly, as we know, in 2026, this is it's highly topical. A lot of organizations are dealing with, the rapid acceleration of AI adoption, and how do you lead people through this disruptive period?
Definitely, it's a really timely topic, so we're glad to have you on today. And to kick things off, I think it would be helpful if you could sort of break down, when we talk about emotionally intelligent leadership, what does that actually look like in practice, especially in organizations increasingly shaped by AI and automation?
In practice, emotionally intelligent leadership shows up in how leaders make decisions, not just what decisions they make. It's the ability to stay grounded under pressure, to read the emotional climate within an organization. It's the ability to respond with intention rather than reactivity. It's really understanding, when to slow down when things are really accelerating. To pull the organization back, to keep them grounded, to keep them together, to tap into the things that make us most human. And increasingly, that's happening in an environment that's mediated by technology.
Definitely. There's just so much changing today. And I just love to hear, why do you think emotional intelligence is really becoming more critical for leaders in today's workplace?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think AI is rapidly absorbing technical and analytical tasks. We're seeing across the board, right? So whether you're in finance, you're seeing finance roles, being taken over by automation, being taken over by agents. You're seeing that happen in HR. You're seeing that happen in marketing, sales. It doesn't matter, what aspect of the organization you're working in. What I'm finding is that human skills that can't be automated are becoming the biggest differentiator. Emotional intelligence is no longer a soft capability. It's the operating system that allows, leaders to bring the organization together to create that interstitial tissue that really gels the organization, and to be able to lead diverse teams, sustain performance in high change environments. What we're seeing, the pace of change with AI is unlike anything we've seen in the past when it comes to technological change. In the 90s, right, we all saw ERPs and CRMs being put into place, and there was some level of automation there, but it was a vastly different type of innovation. It was a vastly different type of change. What we're seeing now is leaders having to make the decision about not just what to automate, but who to displace. And we saw that at the tail end of 2025, tens of thousands of jobs across Fortune 500 companies being eliminated due to AI. As work becomes more distributed, more digital, more complex, leaders are increasingly evaluated not by what they know, but how they relate, how they build trust, how they regulate themselves and bring out the best in others. Emotional intelligence is what enables leaders to keep organizations cohesive and resilient when everything else is accelerating and slightly chaotic.
Definitely. I love kind of what you mentioned that emotional intelligence isn't this soft capability, right? That kind of goes into my next question, since we know there are some leaders who maybe don't understand that yet. They still underestimate emotional intelligence. So with that in mind, how can L&D teams really position it as a core, trainable, and also measurable leadership capability rather than an innate personality trait?
I think the key is really reframing emotional intelligence as a behavioral capability, not a personality, right? L&D teams need to anchor emotional intelligence in observable behaviors, how leaders listen, how they respond to conflict, how they make decisions under stress, and create psychological safety within their teams. Research shows that emotional intelligence can be developed through intentional practice, right? Feedback, reflection. When L&D links emotional intelligence development to business outcomes, such as retention, engagement, leadership effectiveness, it pairs it with validated assessments, it becomes clear that it's not abstract, it's not soft, it's not innate, it's a learnable, measurable, and mission critical skill. Let me add to that. I think, one of the things I found, when I was doing my doctoral research, which is what led to my book. I studied the efficacy of executive development programs on the development of emotional intelligence. And what I found was that power skills, right, are healing capabilities that leaders need to navigate complexity, build trust, drive performance in this increasingly AI augmented world. And what I mean by that, it's things like self-awareness, empathy, adaptability, judgment, ethical reasoning, uh, and the ability to influence and collaborate and lead through uncertainty. These are the real skills that are not, they're not soft skills, right? When you think about what AI is doing, yeah, we've seen AI have the ability to execute flawlessly the technical skills, right? The things that we've historically trained our people on. Yeah. Hey, how do you execute this or that better from the perspective of your role? How do you increase your knowledge base in this particular domain? Like AI does all that, like in spades and so much faster. But what AI doesn't have is what's human. That's emotional intelligence, understanding, how to make a moral or ethical decision, and those are trainable skills. And it's not something, we would hope, right? Like everybody's just born with like amazing morals and amazing ethics and amazing emotional intelligence and the ability to be self-aware. But that's just not the reality. But it is trainable.
Definitely. So when we're kind of talking about emotional intelligence from your perspective, what are the core components that leaders need most right now? And where do you see the biggest skills gaps?
I'd say that the most critical components are self-awareness, one, emotional self-regulation, empathy, relationship management. I think among those, self-awareness is often the most weak when it comes to leaders. Um, but it's also the foundation for everything else. Like if you're just generally unaware of your own behaviors, the other things are really, really difficult to bring to bear. In my experience, many leaders operate on autopilot. They're unaware of their stress responses, their communications patterns, or how their assumptions are affecting others. The biggest gaps often show up in moments of pressure when, it's big decisions that need to be made. Handling feedback defensively, misreading team morale, or defaulting to control when collaboration is needed. You have to kind of command and control versus, hey, let's integrate the team and figure out how to move forward. These gaps become more costly as organizations scale and they integrate more automation. We've seen that, right? In recent history with leaders, where they've made decisions to lay people off, and they haven't really thought through the human impacts of that, relative to AI adoption. And next thing you know, you're having a virtual town hall, and people are getting fired via email and SMS. And the impact, not just to the people who are affected, but to the morale of the rest of the people in the organization who remain and are trying to execute on the vision of the company, becomes imperiled.
Yeah, those are all great points. So we kind of touched on the fact that emotional intelligence is trainable, and I want to dig deeper into the measurement aspect here. So specifically, how companies can measure emotional intelligence in leaders. Are there any specific metrics or assessment methods that can provide those insights?
Absolutely. So I think, effective measurement combines, one, validated assessments, right? Things like, 360-degree feedback tools, for example, the ESKI is a great one. And behavioral data over time. It's longitudinal, right? Like, it's not something you're going to observe somebody for a week and really be able to assess their emotional intelligence. Uh, Tools that are grounded in EI research, as I mentioned, ESKI, for example, can assess self-perception, social awareness, but also multi-rater feedback, right? Is super important. And that's one of the things you get when you have a full ESKI, is that multi-rater feedback. One of the things I found through my research was that, self-reporting measures, like, it's no bueno, right? We all know. Are you going to say, yeah, I lack self-awareness? I am unempathetic. I'm not a good team player. Like, no leader is going to give themselves a negative rating, right? Like, it's just not going to happen. But, one of the things I found was really, really interesting. Actually, what led to me going to an executive development program, the AMP program at Wharton, back in 2016, is, I did a multi-rater survey as a leader. I was surveying at the time as a chief digital officer. And it was really the first time I'd ever taken one of these leadership assessments, where I was being assessed by my subordinates, by my peers, and then I also provided my own insights. And when I saw the readout, I was mortified. It was like, I was like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, I need this training. I cannot believe, that I have such shortcomings in these areas. And then, it was only through going to this really immersive experience where, where I was focusing on developing my emotional intelligence, that I start to kind of, seize those opportunities and close the gaps. Yeah, I think, one of the things I found is the most meaningful insights come when EI data is tracked longitudinally, and it's paired with outcomes, like engagement scores, turnover, team performance. Measurement's not about, labeling leaders. It's about creating awareness, accountability, and a baseline for the development of these skills, because it's hard. It's really, really hard. We're all the sum, right, of our experiences, of the things that we've taken on in our personal, professional lives. All those come to bear in your emotional intelligence at work, right? So, yeah, making change requires a number of variables.
As a learning leader, your organization looks to you to close skills gaps, meet compliance standards, prepare your business for the future, and more, which is a lot of responsibilities, especially for a team of one. That's why we created Tia, your AI-powered training industry assistant. Tia is upskilled on training industry's vast library of resources, including research, job aids, course content, and more. Use Tia as your guide for tackling any L&D task. By becoming a training industry member, you'll gain access to Tia in addition to becoming a part of the membership community, where you can connect with like-minded L&D practitioners and experts. Driving the business of learning can be challenging, but remember, you don't have to go it alone. Try Tia today for just $30 per month. Sign up at trainingindustry.com/membership.
Definitely. I'd love to circle back there about kind of that immersive experience that you went through, because I'd love to talk about, like, from a learning design perspective, what approaches work best for developing emotional intelligence? So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
One of the things that I pointed out in my book is that it's AI can't be taught through slide decks. You're not going to bring some leaders into a room and present some slides on empathy and experience and expect that they're going to learn how to be empathetic. It's developed through experience, and it's also longitudinal, right? There's a time element, right, required to develop emotional intelligence competencies. Leaders need safe environments to do it in, but I think the most effective approaches are when you combine that psychological safety within the learning group. And what I found is often it's very, very difficult to do inside of the four walls of your organization. Because unless you have an inherently psychologically safe environment, you know, leaders amongst other leaders, their peers within the organization, their ability to be as vulnerable as you sometimes need to be to develop these skills is very limited, right? Because you'd be walking down the hall and be like, "Hey, Bob, hey, Micah, like was wild to see you cry yesterday in that session," right? It's they're not going to go to that level. So what I found is the psychological safety aspect is really, really paramount, but also it has to be immersive. You've got to get people into situations where they're creating that emotional vulnerability to uncover how you respond in certain high stress situations. So simulations, black swans, right? In that kind of immersive environment can be really, really helpful. It has to be practice based, and it's got to be reflective, both individually, right? Your ability to understand how to reflect on your own behavior, but then also to have peers engaging, right? So simulations, real world stress challenges, guided reflection, coaching is paramount. Coaching has to be integrated and it has to be sustained. It's not like you can go through, a training program for the development of emotional intelligent leadership, have 2 coaching sessions, that coach then goes away, and all of a sudden, hey, you're just 100 times better than you were before. It just doesn't happen that way. I think leaders they need that safe environment where they can experiment. Experimentation also comes through the kind of coaching process, right? When you're kind of dialoguing, hey, like, well, when we went through the training, we experienced this, and this is how I responded, and this is how my teammates, shared how I responded, and now I'm seeing in practice, right, how that is playing out in real time. That feedback loop that you have with your coach will help you to improve over time, and it's very much longitudinal, right? In terms of the change happens over a long period of time. But learning should also be designed to mirror the complexity of leadership itself, right? When you're thinking about the complex, messy, human, emotionally in charged environments that we're working in, while simultaneously providing structure for insight and growth. Does that make sense?
Definitely. It's kind of like finding that right mix of modalities is really key here.
Mhm.
And we know there's a lot of leadership courses in the market. There's also a lot of providers in the market, a lot of providers offering this type of training. In fact, the leadership segment is one of the largest in the corporate training market. We just updated our corporate training landscape map. It provides this visual of all the vendors in the market, and there were 295 leadership training companies. So it's a lot to sort through, and it can be challenging just knowing where to start. So sort of with that as context, Micah, what's one practical step our listeners can take to just get started building emotionally intelligent leaders in their organizations?
There are a lot of leadership providers out there.
Yeah.
And I would argue, right, a large majority of them are not necessarily creating programs that are designed to develop emotional intelligence. One, it is very difficult, right? The things that have to come together in order for that to work, are new loops, right? One, you know, it's something that you can't do, again, in my humble opinion, inside the four walls of your organization, which means that you need to take your leaders out of the environment. They need to have, whether it's, weekend convenings or multi-day convenings over a long period of time, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. It has to be experiential, right? One of the things we know about adults, right, and adult learning is that we don't, you know, training, you know, uh, work by, traditional practice, right? Training as, delivery of material. It doesn't work for changing behavior, right? You have to actually experience things. So that learning has to be experiential. I'll give you an example. When I was going through the Wharton Advanced Management Program back in 2016, we had a number of amazing real world simulations, right, that were designed to induce anxiety, to bring you out of your comfort zone, which is where you really begin to learn, and to inject you into situations where you're not going to have the ability to respond normally because you've not been in those situations. One example would be, they had a firefighting simulation at the New York Firefighting Academy, where you're literally put, into firefighting gear. You're given a couple of hours class, that they hand you hoses, put you into a room with like an actual fire, like, hey, put that fire. That is something where, many of the leaders that I was in that program with had never experienced anything like that before. And the reaction to it, right? How you communicate, how you collaborate, how you provide feedback, how you just generally respond to that level of stress. Things like, putting a bunch of people into a crew boat, right? And rowing for the first time together. I'm not sure if you've ever done that before, but it's absolute chaos because nobody really knows what to do. Everybody's rowing in the wrong direction. Tempers flare, frustration. And that's when, you begin to see, how do you really respond, right? Under those high pressure situations. So you need to create, situations where leaders are pushed outside of their normal boundaries. You need to have longevity to it, because, the only way that you can make changes, through, the self-reflection and peer reflection, is if you have time to process it, right? And then try again, be put into a new situation, where you're having to test what you learned. And then the other thing I've learned is that, that there's a lot of, when it comes to emotional intelligence with leaders, it's not just a matter of going through those experiences, being pushed outside your boundaries, being able to reflect on it, but it's also a change in your identity as a leader, who you are. And identity level change, it requires time, and it requires a lot of practice. And then, like I said, I think the other thing you have to integrate in there is the ongoing coaching. And, a lot of leadership development programs are very finite, right? It's like, hey, there's a 6-week program for this, or a 4-week program for that. And, training is transfer, putting some leaders into a room, having great fireside chats and great lectures and amazing slideware. And, hey, we're going to train you with this framework to bring back to the office and implement. Like, that doesn't change behavior. That doesn't change your identity. That doesn't develop a more emotionally intelligent or emotionally resilient leader. So I think you have to look for the programs, right, that are immersive. It's like comparing like, 4 days, in an amazing, executive offsite with all the accoutrement, at the Ritz-Carlton in Aspen or wherever, with, like 3 days of outward bound. You're going to, if you're the 3 days of outward bound in the wilderness, having to test yourself, is going to teach you a lot more about your emotional intelligence than sitting in a room with peers and, having cakes and tea in between sessions.
Definitely. Got to step outside your comfort zone to really grow, as they say. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Mikah. How can our listeners get in touch with you if they'd like to reach out?
Sure. So I have a personal website, which you can find me on. It's MikahSellers.com. It's MikahSellers.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm happy to link it with anybody who may have questions about my book, or, you can go to my blog. I'm continuously updating that with fresh content. And I also have a podcast of my own. This is Forces of Change. and it's on Spotify as well as Apple and YouTube.
Awesome. Well, for more resources, check out the episode description or visit the show notes on our website at trainingindustry.com/podcast. And make sure to subscribe for more timely episodes like this one. Until next time.